This morning's session is on sacred life, sacred death. I shall ask all the speakers to introduce themselves briefly. I think I should say a few words on my own behalf. I am John Webster. I'm a Professor Emeritus at the Bristol Vet School. Emeritus is Latin for unpaid, as you all be aware. I came to the University of Bristol in 1977 after a varied career, including teaching cowboys in Western Canada. But when I first got there, my first remit was to establish a scientific research centre for the study of animal welfare. And it wasn't the first in the UK, but I do count myself amongst the oldest inhabitants of the animal welfare movement. And the Bristol unit now is long since my time, but is now probably the largest animal behaviour and welfare unit in the world, I think now. It's about 65 strong, which is quite impressive because we started with 2. Also at the Bristol University, or also on the Langford site at Bristol, was the Meat Research Institute, which was shut down by the Agricultural Research Council, but then joined us at Langford. And they did pioneering work on humane slaughter, and a lot of their work melded in with ours, and we eventually became the one unit. And they've worked on humane slaughter from everything from cattle to lobsters, and they really have made a big contribution, practical contribution, to the humanity of the killing process. I want to make a few points of principle and practice to act as terms of reference for our discussion. The principle of this session is sacred life, sacred death. In practice, I would equate that to compassionate treatment of the animal from the moment it is disturbed on the farm. We talk about farm animals, and the moment we disturb it on the farm until it is dead. So that's the temporal terms of reference. I would also add that my professional, not necessarily how I feel, but my professional input to the whole matter of animal welfare is to act 100% as an advocate for the animals and their welfare. So I do not consider it my professional business to consider human sensibilities. I'm aware we all have our sensibilities, but I don't consider that's within my professional remit. It follows from that in practice that I operate on the basis it matters not at all to the animal what we think or how we feel. It is what we do that matters. And it is our actions, not our thoughts, ultimately, that matter to them. So, proceeding then, the principle again, in this context, is one which I totally accept, which is reverence for life, reverence for all life. And in the practical terms, in the context of this talk, we have to do our best to achieve, for those animals in our care, we have to do our best to promote a satisfactory quality of life in life and at and around the time of death, which is inescapable, one way or another, to minimize suffering. And again, it's in practice, if we can achieve those animals whose death occurs at a time of our choosing, we have a responsibility to ensure that the gentleness of their death is considerably better than that which will attend probably our own deaths. Now, another matter of principle, which is something I've abided by all my life, and that is that the capacity of an animal to suffer is defined entirely by its own sentience. And in terms of what matters to the animal, well, how we define the animal as pet, as food animal, as work animal, as vermin, or even most bizarrely as game, is of no concern to the animal at all. And therefore, our respect, the principle of reverence for life and respect for the animal, means that at the time of death, our responsibility to minimize suffering applies equally to the rat as it does to the pet dog. And that is an attitude I've always worked by. Can't avoid it, but we must minimize suffering. So, to this session, which is mostly concerned with the transport and slaughter, stunning and slaughter of farm animals, I make the practical point, most important practical point, that the stress begins at the time they're first disturbed on the farm and only ends with death. And the other point I will make is that the primary stress at this time, the overwhelming stress, is fear. And arguments in UK law that what we must do is minimize pain at the time of death is something of an irrelevance. Because probably, I'm going into getting halal slaughter, and I have a great respect for the for the humane halal movement, which in the UK started, I think, with the Imam of Woking in 1934 or 1935, so it has a good history. But when we talk about the pain of a process of cutting the throat or whatever, that in an animal is conscience is singular irrelevance to the fact that it's conscious that it's choking to death in its own blood. So the big problem is fear, one, and in my mind, and two, the big problem, that fear problem starts from the moment you take it away from the natural sight and sounds of farm activity. Now, I really could say an awful lot about slaughter, and probably will during the course of the morning, but I think it's quite enough for me for now.
So, first of all, I just want to express my gratitude that I've been given this platform with two people that I admire. I don't know you, so I don't admire you yet. But I admire Ruth and I admire Lutfi in two different ways. I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Lutfi has been an inspiration to me because he is the pioneer and the originator of the organic halal movement. And I've been to the farm a few times, Willowbrook farm, and he's the reason why I've got an Eco Angus biomass boiler. So he should be given commission for that. He's also just, he's someone who is doing, and I think that's a very important part to what we're talking about at this whole conference, turning knowledge into action, and he does that. And then secondly, Ruth has been, inspiration is not enough to describe her. She's been a spiritual support, she's been a physical support, she's actually mentoring my sister and looking after my sister. She's become integral to us. Actually was the reason why we moved to Wales, because I went on a course at her farm, and it kind of just opened up a whole new world, including the fact that it was only 2.5 hours from London, which I didn't realise it was. So Ruth is the reason why my life has taken the taken the direction as well. So I couldn't believe that they were both on the panel. It just was like, how did that happen? And also just the fact that I was planning to come to Sustainable Food Trust next event because I really enjoyed it, and then they asked me to talk. So I feel I'm very humbled by that. My name's Muhsen Hassanin. So Muhsen comes from the roots out of the word of ihsan, and a muhsin is someone who practices ihsan. And ihsan is the act of perfection, doing something in a perfect way. So I kind of see myself as a little bit of a permaculture samurai. Yeah? Yeah, you know what I'm saying? Exactly. So, and one of the reasons why I got into what I'm doing now was because I was on a very very different path. It was a marketing, face-to-face fundraising. It started becoming very cutthroat, and I came across some new knowledge within the permaculture movement that changed my direction. But just before that, I'll just explain our company a little bit. We're an organic halal meat supplier. We have a slightly different model to Lutfi, who's going to talk about his farm a bit more afterwards. But we basically source meat from organic suppliers, and then we slaughter them and control the slaughter process. I'm a slaughterman, my business partner's a slaughterman. We either slaughter it ourselves or have people we know who slaughter in it, or work with slaughterhouses very closely that we are happy with their standard. We then process all the meat on our own processing site to keep the whole chain halal. And we have organic certified chicken and organic certified lamb, some biodynamic lamb that's coming in now, and we basically distribute that to our customers. So that's our basis. So some people recognize, anyone know this man? Yeah, quite a few people do. So Bill Mollison was a changing force for me, and this quote, I'm going to read it. The greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale in our own gardens. If only 10% of us do this, there is enough for everyone. Hence the futility of revolutionaries who have no gardens, who depend on the very system they attack, and who produce words and bullets, not food and shelter. That's the deepest quote ever. Yeah, that quote just absorbed my life. When I read that for the first time, because I thought, oh my God, that is just, we cannot survive in a system, and this is what this whole thing's about, that is draining the resources of the earth. And what could I do? I was out there talking to people in the street about all these causes, you know, disability, people in you know, in some of the most disastrous situations, in war-torn situations, refugee crisis, all these kind of things we were talking about, and getting people to donate money to NGOs, that I just felt like something's missing here. And it was that practicality and that actual doing. And that's something that I've taken from this. And it basically changed my life completely, because I went from working on the streets of London to taking up growing potatoes in my garden. And that was the first step to doing what he said, which is just a little bit. You just do a bit, and next thing you know, I ended up on a small holding in Wales, and hopefully this year we'll have 50% of our food and our consumption coming from the farm. So that's something that, you know, is a journey that starts with just literally putting some cardboard down, a bit of sheep mulch and some wood chips and a bit of compost, putting some potatoes and going, wow, this grows. So yeah, that was a big turning point for me. So this is the only surviving picture I have of my business partner, Zeki, in the corner. So we're both feeding goats there, and that's on Zeki's small holding in Kent. This was the beginning of the journey, really. We don't have those goats anymore. They're all gone to meat or growing babies somewhere else. But yeah, this was the beginning of the journey for me. I used to go to Zeki's farm all the time as a customer to buy his meat, and then he was like, "Why don't you join us?" Because obviously I talk all this permaculture stuff all the time and all this kind of excitement stuff. And he goes, "You could be this guy, the one who goes on the mics and stuff." So I did. I took it up, and the slaughter process was the sort of the logical next step. I can't be consuming this meat. I can't be doing all this and not talking from experience. So, a bit gruesome, but this is. I hope no one's easily. I forgot that it's blood coil. You know, makes people a bit. Can put people off. But basically, this is a simple cone system in the slaughterhouse that we use. And this is Christmas turkeys that we're doing here. Exact same process. You see the electrical stunner on the wall. It's a head-only stunner. It clips onto the side of the turkeys, and you press it until they get completely electrocuted, and then they sort of go limp, and then you slit their throat. Now, I don't actually believe that's the best way to do it. My personal belief is, I have a feeling that the cone is enough, and I think that is that. The way that Joel Salatin does it on his farm, where the animal is coned and restrained, is enough. And I think there's a lot of there's lots of research batting around, but the reality is it's a quick throat slit. The animal's going to be out already, and that's kind of So, but this is the way we do it. So a lot of people think, well, halal's different. That's no different. That's the same slaughterhouse. It's just that slightly overweight gentleman that's there killing turkeys and saying one different thing, which is different to a normal slaughter, which is in the name of God. In the name of God, God is great. Now, that's kind of, there's a lot of anthropomorphism that comes up with God and God in the sky and whatnot. But basically what you're doing is saying this that's in front of me, that I have power over, because you've given me this power, I am grateful for that, and this animal has sacrificed in its life, and we thank you for that. That's the essence of it. That's what halal is in terms of slaughter. Yeah. But this is what tayyib and halal is about too. This is my a view from my farm. So sunrise in the winter, and for me, it's a journey of expansion. And it's a journey of knowing that whoever you're around you have to try and make them experience as much expansion as possible. So that's animals, your children, your family. It's kind of similar to what you said about the principle of the rat or the sheep. Or dog, exactly. Every single being has a right. Every single being has a right on this earth. Now, spiritually or non-spiritually, godly or not, whatever which way you want to look at it, from our perspective as Muslims, that is a right that's been given to us, and God actually offered that right to the mountain, and he said no. Or she said no. The mountain said no. Can't take that on board. So human beings were given that choice, this responsibility on this earth to walk gently and allow people to experience and beings to experience expansion and freedom. Yeah. So this is why I moved my family to that view. Yeah. My wife feels it's constriction because she can't go shopping, right, as easily. But she realizes the benefits. And the benefits for me, I'm nearly finished. This is my little boy, and this is a completely different child than 2 years ago. And that for me is the quintessential expression of what halal and tayyib means. It's not about slaughter only and this sort of splitting hairs knowledge. It's about a whole lifestyle and a whole way of thinking and a whole understanding. So my children now know what death's about. They know what slaughter's about. They've seen animals get killed. They have seen carcasses. They've seen whole body. They've seen eggs. They've seen chicks. They've seen the creation. And Richard Dunn, I think it is Richard Dunn, the speech that he did yesterday about kids. It was like ecstatic. I felt ecstatic when he was talking about it because I thought that I've seen the effects of that. When you see a child, when a child sees a seed or sees an egg or sees these things, it completely and utterly molds their experience for the rest of their life. So that's what, and the last image is someone who is actually completely and utterly the direction. So Lutfi and Ruth get some little bit of thing, but this man here, with or without, we should be in a state of compassion. So whether you're in a torture chamber in Guantanamo Bay, and I use that term because I've met people in that situation, or whether you have affluence in your life, or whether you are living in Grenfell Tower, or whether you're living in the place opposite Grenfell Tower, you have to be in a state of compassion wherever you go, with or without. And that's what halal, tayyib, and ethical means. It's moving with that state and taking on every single task with that ihsan that I talked about earlier, or that state of perfection. Yeah. So it's giving everybody that compassion to expand and be free, and to treat everybody with the same, treat everything with the same respect, and with or without your circumstances changing. If you're in the worst circumstances or the best circumstances, you still have to be in that state of compassion. Next slide. And that's us. We're done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So welcome everybody. Croeso. My name is Ruth, and I actually came to school here. So it's very odd to be back. I grew up in Snowdonia. Welsh is my first language. And my parents wanted to send me to a private Welsh-speaking school, and it was the only one in the country. The fact it was a boys' school didn't stop them. So there were a few girls. I have many happy memories of lots of wild adventures in this building. So, I'm a farmer and I'm a psychotherapist. And that combination took me into an abattoir to learn to be a slaughterwoman. And when I tell people that, they're very surprised. But to me, it makes perfect sense. And the reason it makes perfect sense is because as a psychotherapist, what I really believe is that contact, intimacy, relationship, engagement are all that really matters. So, when we're on our deathbeds, those are the things that we will both remember with joy and perhaps with sadness. But it felt to me as a farmer that, and as an eater, as someone who loved eating, the actual moment of slaughter, what was occurring in the abattoir, was the thing that I wasn't able to have any contact with. It was a real mystery to me. So I totally agree with what John said in his introduction about the disturbance being the key point that we have to give our attention to. And that there are lots of problems that we need to think about in terms of transport to the abattoir and the lairage, the way that the animals are held before they're slaughtered. But for me, when the animals disappeared into the abattoir, that was the missing link. And I noticed that people would come to the farm and they would say to me, "What lovely sheep you have, what sweet lambs, how can you eat them?" And it felt to me that we have a kind of cultural dissociation, if you like. In a way, the reverse of what we need to be. So, if you bear with me, because this is a little bit of a rambling thought, but what I started to realize was that by having such an emotional response, without being able to include death in our vision of the life of the animal, we were dissociating and denying the death from the animal we loved. And that is a really serious problem. Because if we cannot stay with the reality that death is what occurs, then we cannot engage. And so it felt to me, I really hear what John is saying about the human dimension, but I felt that the human dimension became very crucial. Because the actions as humans that we are willing or not willing to take arise directly out of our ability to think and be present to what we are doing and the way that we are living. So I started to meet people who ate fish, but not meat. And I was curious about that, because actually fish slaughter is a really big issue for me. You know, it's the equivalent of putting a plastic bag over the head of a lamb. It's a suffocation. But I started to realize that people identified more viscerally with mammals, with lambs and with cattle. And that enabled them to have some kind of relational connection which aroused some kind of compassion. Whether it went in the right direction is another question, because there was an unbearableness there for them. But in terms of chicken and fish, and pigs as well, interestingly, the disconnection was much more extreme. And of course, it's my view that the suffering for those animals is much more extreme, both in terms of how they live and often how they die. So, that took me into an abattoir. And I remember the first day, I did learn to slaughter on the farm. One thing that's important in this story is that my father was a farmer and a vet, and my mother was a midwife. And I think that's really important because I grew up with a lot of bodily fluids, basically. I wasn't fazed, you know, it was a very visceral childhood. And I feel incredibly grateful for that, incredibly grateful. I did see cruelty. When I was a child, anaesthetic was not widely used on the farm, and I remember one of the most shocking things I ever saw was cattle being dehorned without anaesthetic. You know, it was this massive struggle of man and beast, you know, and there was something thrilling about it, but it was also cruel, and there was a lot of pain. But I think the fact that I grew up with that contact kind of called me on this journey. And of course, as Muhsen has alluded to, a lot of children now don't grow up with that contact. And a lot of us don't see our ancestors, our elders die. We don't get to take care of them. We don't get to wipe their bottoms or wipe their noses. We give it to someone else. And it usually poorly paid. And exactly the same thing is happening in abattoirs. So when I went into the abattoir, my real dread was what would be happening at the point of death. But actually what I discovered was that what was happening in lairage, what was happening when the animals came off the trailer, what was happening between the people who worked in the abattoir, none of whom wanted to be there. I think there was a lot of shame, they were poorly paid, and there was a lot of racism too, because the vet, every abattoir has to have a vet, and she was Romanian, she was female, and she was Romanian, and there was a lot of prejudice against her. And as a therapist, I just felt there was a lot of unconscious, difficult feelings swirling around. And one of the people who worked there, I would say he had special needs, and he was really badly bullied by the other people. So So it was much more complex than what I had expected. And in fact, the actual slaughter of the animal seemed to me to be one of the least problematic parts of the process. And it was the way I learnt to slaughter. It was they didn't do cattle there. It was a small animal abattoir. They did sheep and pigs, and they would stun the animal and then cut its throat. So from this, I decided to offer a workshop where people could come and witness the slaughter of a sheep. And Muhsen came on that workshop. It was a very profound experience. And what I realized was that being witnessed by people, and vegetarians would come, and I really was very moved by people coming on this workshop. The very act of being witnessed called on me even more to be self-aware in what I was doing. And when I was slaughtering, I don't do it anymore because my life has moved on and I haven't got the capacity for it now. But what I realized was that in order to do it well, required a lot of focus, a great deal of presence, a sense of responsibility, not just to the action, but also to the wider world. You have to, in order to do that act and feel in integrity around it, it seemed to me that you have to own it as a spiritual act, but also as an act of power. And power is really important, I think, in this conversation that we're having, because as a culture, we are not very good at talking about power. We have a very ambivalent attitude towards our own power. We tend to push it aside. We don't own it. We don't own unembodied power, and we give our power away and we deny our power. And as a result, I think there's a lot of abuse of power. So in choosing to slaughter sheep that I had raised from birth, or pigs that I'd raised from birth, or cattle that I'd raised from birth, I had to be upfront and in good relationship with my own power, because we do have a lot of power over the animal world. And we need to sort of think about that. We need to engage with it and not duck it. And we need to be with the complexity of it and the difficulty of it. And we need to be willing to kind of step into the space, really, because if we don't understand about how animals live and die, or how we live and die as human animals and mammals, then it's much harder for us to judge what the issues might be. So one of the things I really hate seeing, now that you've mentioned pets, is a pet rabbit in a cage on its own. I think it's one of the most horrible sights in the world, because rabbits are very sociable creatures and they live in family groups and they get a lot of security. And it's actually very hard to tell when a rabbit is stressed, because like sheep, they just go very still and very quiet. There's a sort of shutdown. And it's easy to interpret that if we aren't willing to go into, what does it mean to be a rabbit? What is the consciousness of a rabbit? If we're not willing to put ourselves in that space, or a fish or a chicken, then we risk dissociation, and that leads to suffering and cruelty. How am I doing on time?
Fine, we've got a couple more minutes.
Couple more minutes. Let me just have a minute to just check my notes. It might be that I've said everything that I want to say. So just to sum up, because for me this is both interesting and the key. So I run something called the Practice of the Wild, and what I'm really interested in is how can we as people put ourselves back into the human-animal field? How can we realize that nature isn't something that happens out there, but is actually, we're right in it? But the trouble is, at the moment, we're in it, and I'm talking collectively, unconsciously. And so we are we are in relationship with animals and vegetables and plant life because every choice we make impacts on them. But if we're unconscious of it and not really willing to grapple with it and engage with it, then suffering arises. So as a psychotherapist, I work with groups and individuals to restore their sense of themselves as ecological. I absolutely love the word ecological. I don't know if you know, but it comes from the ancient Greek, and it means to know our home. And you know, the earth is our home, and it's a relational space. And we are part of that. We are really in it. But we tend to lumber around without really noticing that we are in it. And unconscious relationships, unconscious thoughts, dissociation, turning away from something because it's too difficult to look at it, is really at the root of a lot of the problems. And I don't say that I find it easy either. You know, I had a ewe once, a Welsh mountain ewe, and I still feel upset about it, actually. I took her to Llanidloes abattoir, and I'd had her, so when I moved to South Wales and bought the farm, my father gave me some Welsh mountain sheep. And they had a Snowdonia Welsh Mountain intelligence, which meant they were a disaster in Monmouthshire, because North Wales was written into their DNA, so they didn't know how to drink water out of tanks. That's an issue for abattoirs, as John will well know. They only knew how to drink water out of streams. And when the weather got bad, they went to the edge of the field, because that's what you do when you're farming on the slopes, when you're living on the slopes of Cadair Idris, because there's dry stone walls for you to find shelter. But actually, what we had was hedges with brambles, so they just got stuck. And I had this very long-haired Welsh mountain ewe, and I just, for some reason, just loved her above all the other sheep that I had. And I had her for about 14 years. And when I finally decided that she needed to die, I took her to Llanidloes abattoir, and just as she was going in, this is before I went into an abattoir myself, just before she went in, she turned and she looked right at me. I'll never forget that. And it went right inside me, right inside me. And I have no idea what that look was about, but it was relational for me. I experienced it as a relationship. As her shepherd, I had a responsibility. And so, great. Thank you for listening. It's lovely to be here.
Lovely stuff. I am actually going to take just a couple of moderator's privilege just to support very strongly a couple of things Ruth said. First of all, I'm delighted that she pointed out we need to broaden the range of our compassion throughout the animal classes. And in that context, I'll just make two observations from the Bristol Humane Slaughter Brigade. First of all, as I mentioned, they developed a humane killer for lobsters, because death of lobsters is a serious thing. It looked rather bizarrely like one of those George Foreman toasters, but I can assure you the killing is instantaneous. The other more solemn one is that the same team, Steve Keston in particular, has shown that when cod are landed in the North Sea, it can take more than an hour for them to lose vital signs. That's a very, very long time. And the second one, which is entirely in support of something I've advocated many times, and she said you have to sort of put yourself into the mind of the cow or whatever. Anthropomorphism, thinking, oh God, how would this animal feel if it were me, is, I don't think, terribly constructive. Reverse anthropomorphism, how would I feel if I were that cow or sheep, is very constructive, because actually we don't know, but we can ask the right questions. And in fact, the whole basis of animal behavior studies directed towards motivational analysis are based upon reverse anthropomorphism. How do they feel? I must ask sensible questions that enable me to find out. So I really thank you for raising those 2 points. Right, if I may pass on to you now, please. Thank you.
Well, hello, thank you for inviting me. And my name is Lutfi Radwan. I run a small farm with my wife in Oxfordshire. I won't talk about myself, but what I firstly would like to just pick up on is the points that Ruth and Muhsen have made, I think, are fundamental to what we're talking about here, is that issues of compassion, presence, responsibility, these are the terms that should always be coming up when we're talking about the welfare of animals, through the rearing right up to the slaughter. And it reminded me of a saying of the Prophet Muhammad that I often quote, nearly always quote when I talk to anyone, partly because it's so short I can remember it, is that ad-din mu'amala. Religion is your social interaction. It's the sum of those relationships and social interactions that you have. We've heard yesterday how the system that we're working within is broken, completely broken, almost to the extent that we can't really think about how we could fix the system we have. Some of the talk about techniques, methods, things that we can change, lairage, transportation, etc., are almost just academic discussions, because the juggernaut of the food industry is moving in such a direction that it's almost impossible to incorporate those concerns into what is really happening around us. Yesterday we heard Prince Charles remind us that in a way this is because we've decoupled our social relations, we've decoupled our society, decoupled ourselves from what he referred to as the perennial wisdom. So if I can take a moment to look at what motivated me from the Quran, from the wisdom of the religion around us, which has inspired me to take the path I've taken to a certain extent. Fundamentally, the Quran has a beautiful verse which talks about the relationship of all creation. Do not those who reject faith see that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation before we exploded them into existence? And we made all living things of water. Will they not then believe? The monotheism of Islam, Judaism, Christianity is not so much about the monotheism, the unity of our creator. Of course, the creator of all of this is one. But also, all that was created is one. There is no separation between us and the rest of creation. We need to put that back into our social relations, our understanding of our relationship with the created world around us. We're all made of carbon and water, all of creation. In fact, if you look at the genetic makeup of the earth, you look at the makeup of the trees around us, and you look at the genetic makeup of us, it's almost all carbon-based life. So on one level, we're all with our feet on the ground from the same stuff, and at the same time, we all have some aspect of us which is head in the heavens or heart in the heavens. So there's a spiritual dimension to all that's created around us, to the animals that we interact with, as well as in us. Probably the major distinction that differentiates humanity from the created world around us is this ability to have free will. In the Quran it says, "He it is that has made you his stewards on earth, and whosoever subverts this trust does so to the harm of his own soul." Well, that brings us in a sense to the story of the fall, something that again unites the three monotheistic religions. The idea of man's fall from the garden and the journey on earth, the spiritual journey of all of mankind, is to somehow reconnect with that spiritual sense, to go back to the garden and to actually use the ability of free will to make the correct choices on our way along that journey. So that relationship with the rest of the created world is not one of dominion. Stewardship never implies ownership. Stewardship is a trust that if we discharge fully is one that leads to our own salvation, as the verse indicates, but also would affect the way that we interact with the animals and the rest of the world around us. I was listening, and of course the title of the conference, Harmony, reminded me that there's a word in the Quran, mizan, which means balance, which could just as easily be translated as harmony. The Quran emphasizes to us that the heavens he has raised and set therein a balance. There's a balance in nature, there's a harmony in nature, there are no discordant notes in nature. In the complexity of what we see around us, there is a harmony. So he has set therein a balance or a harmony in order that we would not transgress that balance. So we're ordered to establish that balance with justice and not to destroy the balance. 4 times the word balance is mentioned in that verse. In the Arabic, it's quite rhythmic, quite poetic. But the point is, what's stressed fundamentally throughout the Quran is this sense of our stewardship, our responsibility toward the rest of the created world, and the requirement that we establish that balance. And as I say, religion is your social interaction. It's not necessarily the higher philosophy, it's not the detailed ritual, it's not a lot of the aspects that we look at for religion, but it's actually what you do. We can see that at the moment we're not doing the right things. Mass slaughter, mass transportation, all of these things, whether you call it halal slaughter or non-halal slaughter, it's all the same. It's all going through the same abattoirs, it's all the same abuse, all of the same welfare issues in the rearing and in the slaughter. And then another verse which should sort of bring us to our senses a little bit, which is actually quite prophetic. Corruption has appeared throughout the land and the seas as a result of the deeds of man, so that he may let them taste some of the consequences of their actions, and in order that they might return to the right path. So again, emphasizing that actually what we see around us is a result of our social interactions. It's the result of our societies that we create, the technology that we create, and that the evil that we see around us is wrought by our own hands. So we have that responsibility. It comes back to this issue of responsibility. On that point, actually, I was reminded again of a beautiful book which was written in the 7th century, in fact. It was a book called The Trial of the Animals. A 7th century group of scholars in Baghdad wrote a fictional story of the animals calling man to account for the way that they were treated. They felt they were being treated wrongly, that their habitats were being destroyed, that they were being taken for granted, they were being burdened with too much weight. So the animals got together and called in a judge to actually adjudicate between them and mankind. And the judge looked at the issues, he heard the testimony of the nightingale, of the donkey. Various animals came and gave their story as to how they were being treated by humanity. And in the summing up, the judge made this statement. He judged in favor of the animals, and that mankind had not discharged that responsibility, that mankind had not acted as a steward. And he summed up by saying, should you err, the animals will begin to disappear one by one forever from the face of the earth, and the air in your settlements and fortresses will become dangerous to breathe. The seasons will be reversed, and your climates turned on end. The animals that you eat will bring sickness and death upon you, and you will no longer rule the earth. This can be reversed, but humans have to realize the extent of their cruelty. So I think that sort of sums up very well the problems that we're facing in the present day. Is there a further slide on there? Actually, I can't remember now. So that's all I'd like to say as an opening statement, is that if we reach back into the perennial wisdom of whichever faith that we come from, we'll find very similar concepts. So it's not complicated. I often actually find talking on these subjects difficult because ultimately we're saying something simple that's self-evident to all of us. Respect for the rest of creation, responsibility for what we do. The problem is not really the philosophy or the answers. The problem is doing. And it's really down to people who are doing the right thing, and those of you who are inspired to do the right thing, to actually take those steps. Now, I was talking to Ruby yesterday about the solution to the world's problems. We were listening to the issues of the circular economy, whether it can be solved by some top-down fixes, market mechanisms that can actually look at the real cost to the environment and force businesses to change their way, whether that can really work when you've got, as I say, a juggernaut of development going in a direction that we really can't change, and world leaders like Trump, who seem to have their, well, I won't say where his head is, certainly not in the heavens. And then the bottom-up approach, which is great. We've got people... sorry, I said it. Okay, you're on... Okay. The bottom-up approach, which we see around us many wonderful individuals doing great things and slowly changing what's around us. But as we change it, the world's moving so fast that actually what we do seems almost meaningless. And it brings me to something that I often say that is misunderstood, and Ruby pointed out to me, I should be careful how I say it. It's not about saving the world, but because ultimately that's God's will. What will happen with the world will happen. What will happen is going to happen around us. But ultimately it's about changing yourselves, changing what you're doing, and changing the community and those people around you. Those that you can affect are moved along the correct path. And just to finish on that, the word halal, which is often bandied about, and I know there's a lot of sort of skepticism about whether halal is good or halal is not. as you've heard, halal slaughter is exactly the same as non-halal slaughter, and it's all terrible to a certain extent, because what we're seeing is the mass slaughter. The word halal means acceptable. Now, in its best form, what would be acceptable are the sort of things that Ruth and Muhsen are talking about, the compassion, minimal transportation, on-farm slaughter possibly, presence, compassion during the process of slaughter. What we're seeing is big industry, mass food supply, and therefore we're not achieving those objectives. So in a sense, I think we're all talking about the same things. The question is how we get there and what we actually do to make a real change. Okay, thank you.
Very much indeed. Author of The Secret Life of Cows, which is a terrific title.
I've just had a text message a few minutes ago with a photograph from the man I left in charge of the farm. I don't normally leave the farm. I feel a bit like a fish out of water. I left him in charge for the first time, and we've just had a baby calf who is the first calf of her mother, who happened to be the first calf of our black Aberdeen Angus bull, and her mother was the first calf of our Murray Grey bull. I only took over the farm when I was 58, which is 6 years ago. I worked on the farm all my life, but when my mother died, my brother has an injured leg and is working for the SFT, as you probably all know. He said, "I'm too old and too lame, do you want to run the farm?" So, yes, but you need to be 18 really, so I've been pretending. The government tells us we've all got a legal responsibility and a moral responsibility to look at our animals once a day. Well, if you read the Farmers Weekly and you see reports of sheep being rustled, and the farmer says, well, they were rustled sometime between the 4th of April and the 5th of May, you wonder whether he didn't actually go and see them or whether he just didn't count them. But although we have the legal and the moral responsibility, we have the privilege and the pleasure and the fun of going twice a day or 10 times a day. We have the pleasure as farmers of engaging with the animals, and we get back from that process as much as we put in. You can't evaluate what the animals get from that. I've got no truck with empirical data, I just use instinct. The animals must get something back, because if a sheep's going to get its head stuck in a wire fence and you only go once a day, it might be there for a very long time. If you go 10 times a day, there's 10 times more chance that you'll find it in time. So we have this moral responsibility, we have this fun, we have the ability to enjoy their beauty. They're innocent creatures, and they interact. This calf that's just been born, her mother, for the last several weeks, has been bumping shoulders with her mother. I know, I can't prove it, and I'm not going to try to prove it, she was getting advice. I've no idea how it's transmitted, but for the whole of my life, I've been watching this happen. Every single time a heifer's going to have her first calf, if her mother's still alive, she finds her and she spends a lot of time. Every time you go in the field, there she is. And the younger brother and the younger sister are there too, because they're hanging around waiting for milk. But the mother and the daughter impart certain knowledge to each other. And whenever that isn't available, when the mother's been killed, then it's to the detriment of that heifer. So we can have the fun, but we should never start, I feel, to be livestock farmers without embracing the idea of the end first. I know several people, many people, who've bought a field, bought a cow, bought a sheep, bought a turkey, without thinking what they're going to do when it comes to the end of their lives. Whether they're going to try to be self-sufficient, or whether they're going to sell that animal, or if the animal gets injured, having the ability to put it out of its suffering. I own a humane killer, and it's the most important thing I own, because so far, touch wood, I've only ever used it once on a deer that was knocked into on the main road, but being able to put it out of its suffering immediately was an immense blessing. So we can't pass that responsibility to someone else. I know many people who do. They say, oh, well, the abattoir is more experienced, and it's true. But you have to embrace that problem. I lost for words now, which doesn't normally happen to me. Many, many years ago, I dreamt up the idea of a mobile abattoir, and the Humane Slaughter Association heroically took it to fruition, point by point, but they were constrained by the existing regulations, which were very top-heavy. They had to have all the bits and pieces that the regulations required. I feel now, with the possibility of Brexit, we've got an opportunity to find a solution that suits us all so much better, which is not by working within the legal framework, but by changing the rules in favour of the animals, not changing them in favour of the abattoir's profits or the perceived benefits of hygiene with lots of white tiles. But if we think first of the animal having the best death we can possibly arrange, and it's very exciting to me that we've got today, we've got all of you and the speakers, we've all got, I feel, open minds so that we can actually discuss and we can learn, because I think the best thing about being a human being is having the opportunity to learn. And it's very exciting. I learn from my animals every day. They don't make mistakes. If they tell me they need something, they need it. I just have to follow. I mean, the book I wrote, I was ghostwriting for the cows. It was nothing to do with me. I just observed them. It never occurred to me that it was extraordinary, or even, well, it was interesting. But a journalist called Adam Nicholson called at the farm one day to interview us about something general. And every time he asked me a question, I illustrated it by telling him a story about what the cows had done. As you all who've got children would do the same, that a 3-year-old says something very amusing. But talking about death, a friend of mine who's a grandmother had a 3-year-old granddaughter who, when her grandfather died, she managed sort of not to be too upset, although she'd loved him. But a few weeks later, she said to her mother, "Why did Grandpa die?" And her mother said, "Well, he was a little bit old and a little bit ill, and sometimes people, when they're a little bit old, they die." So she thought for a minute. She said, "Well, Auntie Alice must be a little bit dead then." So anyway, Adam Nicholson said, "Have you got any more of these stories?" And I said, "Well, of course, they happen all the time." So he said, "Write them down." And when he went, I decided to do it. I had never any ambition to be a writer before. Farming was too all-encompassing, too busy. But I did it, and so they're written down. But they're not extraordinary. They're what happens everywhere, just that not everyone writes them down. But if we can use this opportunity, probably ignoring the government for quite a long time until we get the idea of how we can change. I don't know if it will be a mobile abattoir. I don't know if it'll be... I think the interim is to keep small abattoirs open and viable. We're very lucky at the moment, having moved abattoirs about 10 times. And the first time I ever took an animal to the abattoir, I took it on a tractor before there were even cabs or roll bars with the horse box behind, to a weeny abattoir that was behind a butcher's shop in the middle of Chipping Camden. There were 2 such butcher shops next to each other, and the effluent just went down into the River Cam. And then we had to move time and time again, and it cost £7 when we were in Evesham, and £24 when we went to Bromsgrove, and now it costs 122 or whatever. And if we were to find a solution of on-farm slaughter, which I would love, so the animals never had to leave the farm, it might put the abattoir out of business that we're currently using. So that is something to consider. But the benefits of loving your animals, and I don't mind using that word, I don't think I'm sentimental. If I am, it doesn't really matter. I kill them anyway. The benefits have a ripple effect. It doesn't just make me feel better, and I hope it makes the animals feel better, but all the people I know, my customers. Some of them ask me the name of the animal they're going to eat. Some of them don't want to know. But the abattoir staff, they feel better if they do the best job they can, if they're allowed the freedom to do the best job they can. Their relatives, the people in the village, it's not just one person. And one of Lutfi's slides said it all. It destroys us if we treat animals badly. So we can do it on a selfish level. We can treat animals well just purely on a selfish level. It doesn't really matter. But I welcome this opportunity, just to engage with people I've never met before. I'm glad I've been dragged away from the farm. Richard, my brother, said this morning, it's such a nuisance for everyone else that he and I are both deaf, and it is a nuisance for all of you. And I said to him, sort of jokingly in the car, well, perhaps people will stop asking us to talk soon. But I'm glad I'm here, and I think I can keep on learning, but we can't let this opportunity slip. I've been in many abattoirs because I decided I couldn't conscientiously eat meat unless I was prepared to see it killed and to take the animals myself and to do the best I could. But I know the system could be better. It seems pointless perhaps to talk about the European Union rules when we may or may not be leaving. I'm not sure if Vince Cable knows more than everyone else, but whether or not. But I believe I'm right in saying that every member country has had the ability to opt out of legislation if it's in the national interest of that country to do so. And a German vet who lives in England and practices in England told me that for many years after the formation of the European Union, Germany did opt out of the abattoir legislation. And I've seen film of a man going to the farm, taking his time, a sharpshooter, being shown which animal who was just happily eating a piece of hay, being killed as it stood, and then hoisted up. So much better than being corralled for however short a time, so much better than being transported to somewhere a long way away. Professor Webster reminded me yesterday when I first met him, which was only the second time is today, I said to him that I did slaughter counselling before the animals went to the abattoir. And it's true, we do walk them through the crush, we load them, we unload them. And having recently joined something called the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association and taking part in their email forum, mostly I just listen or read, it's very exciting to hear and to read what other people do. I've been in isolation for so many years on the farm, hardly ever talking to, or at least the only farmers I met were farmers with no compassion, sadly. My own grandfather didn't believe animals had feelings, apart from horses. He wasn't cruel on purpose. He genuinely didn't believe they had feelings. He would leave them out in all weathers. He would take the tails off sheep with a burning hot iron and hear them screaming and just think it was a sheep noise. It was the first time my mother confronted her father, and they never really made friends again after she was 14 because she tried to stop this practice. So there's ignorance, there's bravado. Even today with profitability in dairy farms being so precarious, there are farmers who've embraced the problem and who rear their calves properly as well as they can. But there's still many others who some of them have them killed on the farm if they're worth nothing. I may be a bit outdated here. I haven't actually talked to any farmers in this respect for 2 or 3 years. But there are some who have the calves loaded up and taken out of sight to be killed. And the heroes of the countryside, the unsung heroes of the countryside, in my opinion, are the slaughterers who do emergency slaughter, the knacker men, all sorts of funny expressions, the jobs that nobody wants to do. The people in the village where they live hate these men because it's smelly and it's difficult. But we had a heifer try to cross the main road when we used to live with a farm that was cut in two by a main road. For some reason, she tried to get to some of the animals across the road and was knocked by a lorry. This is 1966. She wasn't totally killed. We rang these people. They were there in their pajamas within 20 minutes to put her out of her misery. That is incredibly important. So you can't, as a farmer, I think, They told me that they couldn't bear having to load up baby calves and take them out of sight to shoot them. They felt it was wrong. They couldn't argue with the farmer. So before we start farming, we have to embrace what we're going to do at the end. And I'm looking forward to learning from all of you. Thank you.
All of us have clearly been stressing the need for practical compassion to the animals towards the end of their life. But almost exclusively, we've been saying, the routes to this are on-farm slaughter, local slaughterhouses with compassionate slaughtermen, and I agree entirely, the Nakamen are some of the most compassionate people I've met. And that's fine, but we're just washing our hands of the fact that the vast majority of animals are killed in industrial conditions. And that is a fact of life, which, if we have compassion for these animals, we cannot ignore. And I've, in the past, likened this to being a nurse in World War I. The whole thing is absolutely atrocious, but the nurses have to have compassion for the suffering of the individuals wrapped up in this ghastly business. So, in practical terms, the most pressing need is to reduce the suffering on animals at and around the abattoir. And of course, the absolute pioneer, down-to-earth, brilliant pioneer of that is Temple Grandin, whom I've known for over 30 years. And she actually has done more for more animals, more good for more animals than almost anyone I've ever met. Right, that's enough of me. Let's have some questions.
I'll pass it to you, but if I can start with poultry, I know you were asking about lamb, but these are all very difficult questions. People have questions, but they also have no knowledge of what's going on, and that's part of the problem. If you look at poultry, we have these monster breeds, Ross cobs, which are actually industrially reared and bred, but then they're also promoted with the sort of growth promoters of antibiotic use, which increases the growth rate. So those birds are reaching maturity at 4 weeks. And that's an absurd age to reach maturity. You've got no muscle development, therefore the sheer mass of the body allows the bones to just break. So that they're living the last week with broken bones in these industrial sheds. They're transported, and any movement on the vehicle is breaking their bones. They're then shackled up, and then bones are broken again. The amount of chronic suffering of these unnatural breeds, unnatural rearing, that answers your question quite simply, and that's 99% of all the chicken we're eating in the UK. So people need to actually understand what's happening to address these issues. So with poultry, it's very obvious. A natural bird will start to reach maturity at around about 18 weeks when it starts to go into either egg laying or not, if it's obviously for the females. So you can judge the lifespan of a chicken in that way. Most free-range chicken is reared up to about 12 weeks, which means it's reached a sort of a decent age. It's been out on the grass for most of its life. It will have developed the natural muscle and be able to support its body as a basic minimum. So yes, there are really, really serious issues, and by and large, what you're eating is unnaturally reared and unacceptable, I would say, not halal, if we want to use that term. With lamb, can I pass it over to you, Muhsen?
Yeah, from what I understand, the industry standard is sort of 6 to 8 months. Yeah, so we're just, if you're talking about what's being consumed in general halal butchers, a better question would be just ask them, what lamb is that? They wouldn't even be able to tell you. They can't. It's all coming. Yeah, there's no problems at all. Sometimes you can ask them what meat is it, and they don't know. Seriously, I said, he says mixed meat. What does that mean? Yeah, and that's basically mutton and lamb chopped up, mixed together, which goes in the curry. So, it comes down to cooking and food consumption as what's going on there before we even talk about provenance. Because if you just, we have customers that complain about fat all the time, and I had to tell a customer the other day, I cannot change what the farmers are doing. I can't say, you have to say to me, give me lean mince or lean thing, and we'll cut off all that fat, but you're going to get charged for it. It's a premium.
Okay, very quickly. So the industry standard is 6 months to 8 months. So if you're buying lamb, halal or non-halal, it's going to be about the same, perhaps even shorter, 4 months. I think that a really key power for you, the audience, all of us who eat, and for me as well, is to think about how narrow our eating habits have become. So we are now, as a culture, eating very dull tasting meat. We're rejecting mutton, we're rejecting masculine animals. So there's a lot of lack of value in male animals, particularly pigs, because testosterone in the system makes the taste much stronger. So we have the power, as people who are buying, to ask, wow, you know what, I'd like to do it like they do in Germany and really value a strong tasting boar meat. So, you know, and lamb is, people are eating young animals. I mean, chicken, the type of chicken that has just been described has no taste. It's a kind of sponge, really. You know, you might as well eat a sponge.
It's an edible plate, effectively, really. Just one point there, that I would argue it's not the length of the life, but the quality of the life that counts. But, the animals that suffer the most through being pushed too hard, like the broiler chicken, killed at 38 days maybe, like the veal calf in the traditional system, with a ghastly life for 12 weeks, or at the other end of the spectrum, like the Holstein cow, worn out after two lactations. It's the animals that have the lousiest quality of life are killed earliest. So the more natural, slow growth, or the sensible grass-fed dairy cow system actually gives an animal a greater quality of life, and as a spin-off, they have a longer life.
I think, again, it really comes down to responsibility, and probably all of us, a lot of us, I think, are involved in farming. The best customers we have are the ones that we know. They come to us, they see what we're doing, and they get to know the processes on the farm. If you go to Sainsbury's and buy a free-range or an organic chicken, do you realize that could also be a Ross cob bird? It could be reared for only 5 weeks on that farm. No, but my point is, what's the quality of life of that bird that can't carry its own frame? It's not able to range freely on the grass.
Are we sure that birds can carry their own frames on organic farms?
Well, this is what I'm saying.
It's a different species. It's a different strain.
My point is that you can't be sure, because the current rules allow you to rear indoor chickens. As long as you have a pop hole open on the chicken house, it could potentially go outside. It won't, because it has no inclination. So you can be effectively rearing battery chickens and still getting an organic stamp. You can get a free-range stamp.
To be fair, so both Waitrose and M&S have their own slow-growing strains, which are genuinely genetically different, and that, the difference in the genotype or the phenotype, is the biggest step forward in welfare there is, rather than just the environment. Sorry.
Well, that was the point that was made already. It's actually the type of animal.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying to you is, and it comes down to responsibility. You know, when I talk about stewardship, the term khilafa, that responsibility is on the farmer to do the right thing, but it's also on the consumer to go out there and see who they're buying from. You know, we have farmers markets, we have ways of getting know who's producing. So know who's producing, what they're producing, what breeds they have, how they rear their animals. That's your responsibility, I'm afraid. You know, that's the only way we're going to go forward on that, because the rules of even the Soil Association allow effectively, you know, indoor reared birds to be put outside with a fake door open, which they'll never use.
This is one of the strange things about regulations. Sometimes, I mean, I know quite a few very small farmers who've chosen not to be regulated, but they are organic, or they're more than organic. It's always down to the individual, isn't it? I think in America you're penalized for being better than anyone else if you're organic, which is pretty wonderful. But I suppose standards have to exist if you're going to have BC supermarkets that seem to want to put stamps on things. But if you can have everything local, and you can actually, as a consumer, you can know the producer, then that's it. If the producer welcomes you in and is happy to show you what they're doing, you can trust them with their eyes closed. But
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that's what I mean by cultural dissociation. So there's a kind of general reluctance to feel. And I don't always feel sad when I slaughter an animal, I have to say. You know, I don't like slaughtering lambs. I tend to keep mine a rare breed, so they're rarely ready until they're about 14 months old, and I find the taste much better. But, you know, for me, the relationship is about quality of life and knowing that that's why I have them and that's why I farm. And they can have a good death, and I might not feel sad. I need to really focus, and I need to be really present, and I need to have respect for what I'm doing. But I don't necessarily feel sad all the time. But I agree that death is a difficult reality. I agree with that, and we need to grapple with that.
The biggest problem, as I said, is fear. And for many animals, the greatest source of fear is neophobia, fear of the unknown. And as Rosamund said, she sort of puts her animals through pre-slaughter counselling. There's good evidence that animals adapt to transport. So there is quite a lot to be said for getting animals, and animals which have been moved several times in their life become progressively, usually, if it's done well, progressively easier to load, which is a measure of that they're adapting. But we had a talk yesterday, and I've had a personal experience of that, of high incidence of stress-related pale, soft exudative meat in pigs. And the worst cases are those pigs who've come off the most humane and generally loving farms, because the shock of transport and slaughter, shock of transport and journey to the abattoir is much worse for those who've had a happy life than for those who've sort of got adapted to living it rough. Now that's a real worry, but it does suggest we should be considering a little pre-slaughter counselling.
Just very briefly, I think if they don't care, that's an absence in their life. So I would like to reframe that in how can we enhance everyone's life through relationship. So in a sense, it's irrelevant to me the amount that they don't care. What I'm interested in is how can I connect with them so that they do care. That's really, and Waitrose hopefully is also grappling with that.
Sorry, I'm going to have a quickie on this. I'm sorry about this. Yes, they do. Classic farming. It took 50 years for legislation to cause minimal changes in the form of a battery cage for hens. In 15 years, the sale of free-range eggs in the UK has gone up from less than 5% to over 60%. That is a measure of that people are actually caring. And I'll leave it at that. Yes, right. So, yes,
so
please.
can I just quickly?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Caring comes from a moral, a moral centre. So if we bring our children up disenfranchised, feeling that they're not cared for, I was born in North London, on an estate, a council estate, and you do grow up thinking no one cares about you. You have that kind of, there is that. And if we can get to the children when they're young and connect them with the earth, the soil, the animals, and do things with children in schools and get that to them, then care will come into our society.
It's just to come back to something I actually said earlier as well, I think, but we caught a bit of Panorama yesterday, and they were talking about lot-fed beef from America coming over possibly after this Brexit deal. We'll be buying their terrible beef. And it showed that the terrible conditions that it was kept under. And then they came to just a marketplace at a village in a town in England and asked people, would you buy cheaper beef or would you buy British beef? And yes or no. And most people said, no, we'll buy British. Now, sadly, the reason they'd buy British was a sort of nationalistic, we'll buy British, whatever, it's got a little red tractor on it. And it was nothing to do with the issues of how it was reared. So the problem is we're swayed, whether we leave Europe or stay in Europe, we're swayed very much by what we're told, and it's not often the reality of the facts. So an important part is education. People have to be educated, and you say the free-range egg movement, that message has got out. So that's the sea change, and we need to make that sea change through education. But be careful about the top-down approach is still fighting against us. Free range has become popular because industries manage to produce a lot of free range as well. So we've got to fight this battle, as Muhsen says, on the basis of what's right, what's moral, what we should be doing, and through education.
So I would like people to start talking about artisan slaughter. So we need to recognise that slaughter is a skill. It's an incredibly skillful thing to do. And, you know, the word artisan is very trendy. We did it with butchery. 10 years ago, nobody was interested in butchery. Nobody wanted to be a butcher. Butchers were looked down on. That's totally changed. There's been a sea change. So let's do the same with slaughter. And let's have local abattoirs, and let's have mobile abattoirs. And then animals won't have to travel so far.
Thank you. Ian Wilkinson from the Cotswolds. I'm a seed merchant and a small farmer. I'm so glad I came to this debate. I think we've had 4 excellent, well-articulated speakers. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us. My point is very much related to the last points that have been made. It is about education. When you understand what can be done, what can't be done, you will make choices as an eater. And I think all of us that can make those choices, and there are millions, will make sensible choices provided they have access to the information. And it does seem to me that with the supermarkets at the moment, we don't have access to that information at all. We cannot make choices based on rather vague little red tractors and things like that. We need to talk directly to the growers and the producers of the food. I believe the way forward is to have networks of farmers, small networks, who can interact with each other, and it will be in small groups, not big, because big ag doesn't fit this model. But the new future for food production is small networks, because if you have small networks, then you talk to people. You don't talk through supermarkets. And as much as I value convenience, I would more value knowing where my food comes from.
We have the power. We think supermarkets have the power. We don't. At the moment, the supermarkets want to be loved. And having high welfare food is one good way of being loved. And in this country, we have a multiplicity of supermarkets. And if you go into even Tesco's, you can probably pick up 6 different forms of pork defined by how the animals have been reared. So the choice is there. And in this country, it works. Places like Australia, where I've been, there's only 2 supermarkets. The people don't have the power to exercise their choice because the supermarkets don't care. This competition between the supermarkets is actually working remarkably in our own interest.